It began so quietly that, at first, I didn't even notice I was being played. People don't wake up one morning and think, "Today I'll be the perfect victim." It happens in increments, small betrayals disguised as kindness, gentle manipulations wrapped in smiles, a slow erosion of trust, so subtle you barely feel the ground disappearing beneath your feet. When I first met Ethan, I thought I'd found someone who understood me better than anyone else ever had. He had that rare gift of listening, not just hearing my words, but making me feel as though every syllable mattered. I told him about my dreams, my failures, my insecurities. He nodded, sympathized, and encouraged me. At least, that's what I thought he was doing. In reality, he was building a map, one that outlined every weakness, every pressure point, every place where a knife could slide in without resistance. The signs were there if I'd been paying attention. He would offer to help with my work projects, only to take credit for my ideas later. He borrowed money, swore he'd pay me back, then laughed it off when I asked. He made subtle comments that chipped away at my confidence. "Are you sure you can handle that? Maybe you're just overreacting." And I believed him, because I wanted to believe in him. Months turned into years, and without realizing it, I'd let him rearrange my life. Friends started drifting away, their calls unanswered because Ethan needed me. My career stalled, my savings disappeared, and my identity felt like it had been hollowed out. I was, in every sense, the perfect victim, docile, trusting, and convinced I was the problem. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't some screaming fight or sudden betrayal. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining lightly outside, when Ethan handed me a cup of coffee and mentioned, almost casually, that he'd spoken to my boss about my mental health struggles. My chest went cold. I hadn't told my boss anything. I looked at him, then really looked, and saw the smirk hiding in his eyes. That's when I understood. I hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident. He'd engineered it. Something inside me hardened. The realization wasn't accompanied by tears or an explosion of rage. Instead, a calm, razor-sharp clarity took hold. I had spent years being his chessboard, each move dictated by his hand. It was time to flip the board. I didn't confront him. That's what he would expect, an outburst, an emotional display he could twist against me. No, I smiled, thanked him for looking out for me, and began my work in silence. I started gathering things, copies of emails, recordings of conversations, every scrap of proof that painted the picture he'd been so careful to hide. I rebuilt connections with the friends he'd pushed away, planting seeds of doubt about him while pretending to remain loyal. I spoke to people he underestimated, the ones he thought were too insignificant to notice. They noticed. Over the next few months, I let him feel untouchable. I nodded along to his lies, handed over bits of private information he could weaponize, except those bits were carefully chosen, designed to lead him into traps. I fed his arrogance like a patient gardener watering a weed, knowing it would grow just enough to choke him. When the moment finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. I set everything in motion in a single day. My boss received the full collection of evidence, proof of his manipulations, theft, and sabotage. Friends confronted him, armed with truths he couldn't twist. His business contacts cut ties, each one citing my helpful information. By nightfall, his social circle had collapsed, his reputation scorched, and his resources gone. He called me, voice shaking with fury and disbelief. "You did this," he said. I almost laughed. "No, Ethan," I told him, my voice calm. "You did this. I just stopped helping you hide it." When I hung up, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel triumphant either, not exactly. What I felt was a strange, steady sense of balance. I had been the perfect victim for years, soft and compliant, believing the best in someone who thrived on the worst. But somewhere along the way, I'd learned the rules of his game, and then I rewrote them. And that's the thing about perfect victims. Once they stop playing their part, they make perfect masterminds. Ethan didn't disappear from my life right away. Predators rarely retreat quietly. They circle, test the perimeter, look for cracks. And Ethan was no exception. Even after his life started unraveling, he tried to creep back in with the same tactics he'd always used. A casual text, a memory from better times, a subtle guilt trip about how I'd misunderstood everything. I didn't block him. Not yet. I wanted him to believe there was still a thread left between us, something he could tug on. It made him sloppy. In those weeks, I studied him more closely than I ever had before, not as a lover or even as an enemy, but as a specimen. I noticed the way his voice grew tight when control slipped from his grasp, how his charm cracked into condescension when I didn't respond the way he expected. Every attempt at manipulation was another thread I pulled loose from the tapestry he'd wrapped around himself. The thing about masterminding a downfall is that it requires patience, precision, and, ironically, compassion. Not the kind that forgives, but the kind that understands the exact weight a person can carry before they collapse. I didn't want him gone overnight. I wanted him to watch the walls close in, one brick at a time. I wanted him to understand, in those quiet moments before sleep, that every move he had made had brought him here. I used to think revenge was an explosion, something quick, fiery, over in a blink. But it isn't. Real revenge is the slow tightening of a knot. It's the silence between moves in a chess game where your opponent doesn't yet realize they've already lost. It's patience. And patience was something I had learned all too well in the years I spent as his puppet. When I finally severed contact, it wasn't dramatic. I sent one last message. You taught me how to play your game. You just didn't think I'd play it better. And then I was gone. It's strange, walking away from someone who once held your entire sense of self in their hands. For so long, I'd measured my worth by his approval, his mood, his needs.
But now?
Now I measured it by my own silence, my own choices. There was no thrill in the destruction, only a clean, precise emptiness, like a room that's finally been cleared of all the things that don't belong. Sometimes I catch myself remembering the early days, the version of me that existed before the damage, before the lessons. She was softer.
Kinder.
Easier to manipulate. She wouldn't recognize the person I've become. And maybe that's the point. I'm not her anymore. I was the perfect victim. Now I am the one holding the strings. The first time Ethan hurt me, I didn't even know it had happened. It was small, so small I told myself it didn't matter. We'd been at a dinner with some of my colleagues, and I told a story about a project I'd worked hard on. When I was done, Ethan smiled and said, "She's modest." She was a wreck during the whole thing, but somehow it worked out. Everyone laughed, including me. But later, lying in bed, I realized he'd taken my moment of pride and dressed it up as weakness. It stung, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. That was how it always began. There were dozens of moments like that, each one chipping at me just enough to make the next easier. He was careful. If I pushed back, he'd apologize with such conviction I'd doubt my own memory of what happened. If I cried, he'd hold me until my anger melted into gratitude. Looking back now, I understand. Ethan didn't just want control of my life. He wanted to rewrite the way I saw myself. Years later, when the realization of his manipulation finally cracked me open, I started building my plan in secret. The first step was observation. I didn't change anything outwardly. I laughed at his jokes, listened to his plans, let him think I was still under his spell. But I watched closely. I kept track of his lies, not just the ones he told me, but the ones he told others. He lied differently to different people. That was his weakness. The second step was quiet influence. I reached out to people he'd kept at a distance from me, old friends, co-workers, acquaintances. I didn't speak badly about him, not at first. I just listened, shared small, carefully chosen stories, and let them start connecting the dots themselves. People believe what they discover more than what they're told. The third step was creating pressure points. I let him find out certain things: fake frustrations, false plans, made-up problems, knowing he'd act on them. Each time, his reaction made him look reckless or dishonest to someone else. I planted seeds in the soil of his own arrogance. And then came the final step: exposure. I didn't just drop the evidence I'd collected into the world. I curated it. I made sure it landed in the hands of the people who could hurt him most: his boss, his investors, the friends he admired. Each package was timed so he couldn't address one fire before the next was already burning. The night everything came crashing down for him, he showed up at my apartment. His face was pale, his movements jerky. I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to decide whether to beg or threaten. "You think you've won?" he said. I stepped aside, so he could see the packed boxes by the door. "This isn't about winning, Ethan. It's about ending." His mouth tightened. "You'll regret this." I smiled. "I already regret wasting years on you." "This part? This is the only thing I don't regret." He left without another word. I didn't watch him go. I didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt, slowly, deliberately. I reconnected with the people I'd lost. I started saying yes to things I would have turned down before. I learned to keep parts of myself private, not out of fear, but out of ownership. My life was mine again, and I guarded it with the quiet certainty of someone who's been to the bottom and climbed back up without help. And yet, sometimes in the stillness of night, I think about the woman I used to be. The one who laughed off the first cut. The one who mistook a knife for a gift. I wonder if she'd be proud of me now, or if she'd be afraid. Either way, she's gone. I was the perfect victim. Now, I am the mastermind who made sure there will never be another Ethan in my story.